Welcome. I'm John Bear Raber, speaking about the first person's history of the world. Continuing the concept of history of the world, people originally spread around the world by the coastal means, is what I said in my first program. Now I want to talk about what happened next, because originally people were hunter-gatherers, whether they were gathering clams and shell mounds or hunting saber-toothed tigers by drawing them into the water and drowning them. But they were still following their food source. As they moved further away from the shores and up the rivers, they began to follow different sources of food, including plants that were edible, and they would go out to pick berries, and ultimately as they got far enough north where the seasons changed, they actually had to move from place to place to gather all the food that they needed. Not all places were like Hawaii, where all the food they needed was right in their backyard. They had to go in the wintertime, move south from the snow, in the summertime, move north, east, and west to follow what plants and what animals were available. So the original people were hunter-gatherers. But at one point that changed, and most people think it changed at the point where agriculture came about, where people were actually learning how to plant various food sources. I don't disagree with the concept that agriculture came first, but I wonder if it was actually enough to give them the opportunity to stay in one place. If in fact maybe they were making sure the plants that they would come back for in the next season would be there and abundant, so they might have helped clear some space, make it more sunny so that they could have more plants growing, clear out the weeds and the other elements that would be detrimental to the plants. And then as they moved on to their hunting grounds and other areas, when they came back, they would have a larger supply of food, teaching them how to do the agriculture. But if you look at history, it takes so much effort to do agriculture, and basically you have to learn how to store food. If you're going to live off of what you're growing, you have to be able to store it for 12 months or at least 6 months between growing periods, depending on where you're at. So that becomes more difficult. I believe the ability to stay in one place came not with agriculture, but with horticulture, with the ability to start taking animals and using them as a basic food source without having to go and hunt for them. And I have a little story I came up with a while back that might help understand that. It's a question about God. And as far as I'm concerned, God was a nice enough lady, but she should have never given that darling little lamb to that cute little girl, because the lamb became a sheep, the sheep became a flock, then there were goats, there were dogs, there were chickens, there were pigs, there were cows, there were horses. The men didn't have to hunt anymore, so they became gangs. The gang leaders became kings, and all hell broke loose. But then again, I guess if she hadn't given that lamb to that little girl, she wouldn't have been God, would she? The concept of sheep being among the first seems logical. Once again, in order for one to build the trust of the animal, to not try and escape all the time, and you can't fence all wild animals in and they stay there, you have to have something that you're offering to them. So what did humans have to offer to sheep and goats that would have kept them around? And the first concept would be, the first reason the sheep would stay around was the protection. First thing we learned in the Bible was about David fighting off the lions to protect the sheep. A sling with a rock could in fact run off, if not kill, a lion or a wolf or any other predator. And if the sheep learned that they would be protected by the people, they had good reason to stay around. And then they not only had the sheep that they could cultivate for food, but also the milk and ultimately the sheep fur, the sheep hair, for creating clothing. So this would create both an ability, an opportunity, and a reason for bringing sheep into the society. Once you found out you could do it with sheep and then goats, dogs would be a natural thing to help control the sheep. And then moving from there to the larger animals, I can't believe they started with cattle. Cattle would be too much of an opportunity for them to kill you when you're trying to keep them from going where they wanted to go. So I believe the sheep were in fact the beginning, but they started the whole process. And once they were able to control the sheep, then what they had was the ability to start growing crops and using the sheep and the other animals, fish perhaps, birds, as a food supply between the crops growing. And I believe that's how they went from being a hunter-gatherer to a community society. Now what this created was a situation where all of a sudden a few people could grow enough food that not all people were necessary to be part of the process. And the first thing that would happen there is you needed tools for the process, and some people would be much better at creating the tools, especially the stone blades, than others. These people would become the first craftspersons. The need for them to create tools as the tools broke, and they were better at it than somebody doing it on an irregular basis, justified letting them spend the time doing that and not have to help with the hunting or the gathering. After the making of the tools, the next thing they would need is people that could actually protect the people that were paying to be protected. You had your soldiers come in. They could drive away the predators, the lions, the tigers, and the bears, or they could also be turning away people that were trying to take the products that they were making away from them. And that's where you have the beginning of the armies. Once you have the armies, then you have the need for the leaders of the armies, and the leaders of the armies begin to have enough control to where they can actually become the kings. And then once you have the kings and the armies, next natural thing in is the priests, the religious people who use their knowledge as a justification to the poor people to say, well, I can explain why this is so and justify why they don't have to work like the people, why they become part of that craftsman elite program. So now we've gone from hunter-gatherer to a full society where you could have thousands of people working together and have a definite craft society, a definite royalty society, and a clearly established religious society. And that's where we come up to history today, because almost all history from that point on has been defined solely by one thing, and that is war. The people on the Arabian Peninsula invaded the Phoenicians, they invaded the Egyptians, and they ultimately were invaded by the Egyptians, who were then invaded by the Greeks, who were then invaded by the Romans, who were then invaded by the people from Northern Europe. And we see everything in terms of what war existed and what war was fought against too. And we've come to the opinion that all history is defined by war, but it's not. It's not always the axe that gains the trust. Sometimes there's trade involved, and the ability to create something that is of interest to others provides an opportunity to join together with others without having to conquer them. Now, how that played out in our history, or the history of the world that we know, is in the Mediterranean. We know about the Hammurabi and the Babylonians. We know about the pharaohs and the Egyptians. We know about the Greeks and Alexander and the Romans and the Caesars. These were all the conquerors. But most people forget that we had another people that were living at the same time in the same area, and these were the Mediterranean Sea people. These were people that were bringing wood to the Egyptians for the ships. They were bringing bronze to the Babylonians and the Egyptians and the Greek for their tools, their weapons, their armor. These were the people that were traveling around the Mediterranean on their boats and bringing trade goods to all the people, both the conquerors and to people that were just small groups. And because they were trading with these conquerors, they were less apt to be, the conquerors would know that if they conquered them, they would stop the trade. They wouldn't have any reason to bring up trade anymore. As a matter of fact, the way the traders expanded is they would sail to a new coast. They would lay out a blanket on the shore with products that they had to trade, and if the people came out and tried to kill them and stole the goods, they wouldn't come back. But if the people came out and offered something in trade, and they found common elements that they could trade with, then the traders, the sea people, would open a colony there that would join with the local people, marry the local people, and the children would then have relatives both with the trading people on the sea and with the people who were developing the gold, the silver, the food on the land that were being traded around the Mediterranean. So we have the people that started in the areas of the Phoenicians. They moved into Knossos, and the great society around Knossos was undoubtedly a trading society because there's no word of them ever conquering anybody, and yet they were rich enough to build toilets that had a flushing system, irrigation systems, and they did this all on small islands that didn't have enough agriculture to feed them. They moved that on into Italy for a while, and then on to Carthage, and as they moved, the conquerors were near behind them, and Italy went from a trading post to a military outpost that ultimately conquered Carthage. But by that time, Carthage had already moved out through the Mediterranean, and as we know by Claudius Ptolemy and his map, the Phoenicians, the sea people of the Mediterranean, were actually able to circumnavigate all of Africa and map it, which is even more important because they were able to say exactly where these coastal places were in terms of latitude and longitude before we had clocks, before we had all the tools that we have today to establish that kind of information. So this is the history of the world from the first person's point of view, where we talk about the history in terms of trade rather than conquest. Thank you.